If you're an author or plan to be one, get excited because this podcast is for you. Book Marketing Mentors is the only podcast dedicated to helping you successfully market and sell your book. If you're ready for empowering conversations with successful marketing mavens, then grab a coffee or tea and listen in to your host, international best-selling author Susan Friedman.
Welcome to Book Marketing Mentors, the weekly podcast where you learn proven strategies, tools, ideas, and tips from the masters. Every week, I introduce you to a marketing master who will share their expertise to help you market and sell more books. Today, my special guest is Jennifer Longmore. Jennifer is CEO of the Podcast Connector, a thriving global agency focused on connecting visionaries and new thought leaders with aligned podcasts so that they can spread their impact-driven message to the right audience. She's a 10-time best-selling author, media personality, and podcast host. She's also an investor, board advisor, and serial entrepreneur. When she's not running her companies, she'll be hiking with her family, tending to her 100-plus indoor plant collection, or dancing. So, Jennifer, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the show. And thank you for being this week's guest expert and mentor. Yes, and where are you calling in from, Jennifer? I forgot.
I'm just north of Toronto.
I had a feeling you were somewhere in Canada.
You'll hear my Canadian accent.
Yes.
But I will say that I'm an honorary American. I have, I would say about 95% of our clients are American. Not that we, of course, discriminate. We serve everyone, right? And a lot of my colleagues are American. So I've just always been referred to as the honorary American. It's not until my voice maybe gets tired or I'm talking really fast that people will be able to hear the oot and a boot.
I love it. Well, we've got the Canadian and the British and then the American. It's all sort of mixed in together, a nice hodgepodge.
Yeah.
So, Jennifer, you are an expert in helping people generate 6 to 7 figures from podcast guesting with their book. I think that's fascinating. I love the idea of being able to generate income from podcast guesting. Let's talk about that because I know that this is something that I talk to my authors about, the idea of guesting, but you've got to do it right in order to get the results. So let's turn to you and say, how do we do it right?
Wonderful. Well, just to be clear, I don't teach people how to make 6 or 7 figures from book sales. That's a big feat, right? That requires a big publishing house to help with that or a massive, massive following. But I do help people generate 6 to 7 figures every year from what they're selling, meaning whatever services and products that they're selling. And a book can be a really great calling card for that, right? What I think many of us, and I'm saying this, by the way, as someone that's just about to publish their 11th bestseller, right? That's coming out. And so I have the side of what it's like to be an author and all the things that go into that. I have the side of what it means to be a host and what it's like to get good pitches and bad pitches and have authors on that know how to tell instead of going into story because stories sell. I know what it's like to try and pitch myself. And that's actually why I bought the Podcast Connector, because for years I had to learn how to pitch myself really well to broker spots on, back then was online radio shows and TV and publications and so on and stages. I love that I can give back now and give people the shortcuts, right? And teach people how to pitch themselves effectively. So it's kind of a legacy-based built business at this point. But there's some things that people don't tell us, right? When we go with a traditional publishing house, they might give you, let's say, a $60,000 advance for marketing and for PR. And most people will pour that into a PR company. And I'm sure there's PR companies listening. And so this isn't to knock it, because PR companies are great. And we do need PR. But a lot of times those dollars didn't go anywhere. They might have gotten pitched once or twice. And if they didn't get picked up, then that was it. And so as authors, we think, oh, well, when I'm hiring someone to pitch me, that equals guaranteed bookings. And it doesn't. It just means that person's taking usually a lot of money to pitch you to maybe a few outlets, and maybe you might get a booking, maybe you won't. And meanwhile, we're thinking, oh, I'm going to be on 10 different really important shows as an example, right? With the Podcast Connector, you're paying literally a fraction of that to get guaranteed bookings on various shows. And I brought that in because I know what it's like to hire agencies and to think I'm getting guaranteed bookings, but I'm actually just getting pitches, and they're very different. So I wanted to bring that in as a stopgap to make it feel easier for us, because there's so much energy that goes into writing a book. There's some expense that goes into writing a book, and we can maybe have a little bit of financial spending exhaustion by the time it comes to doing the PR. We're also not told that a book essentially is a business, right? It requires its own marketing plan. We can't just assume that if we put a few posts on social media that 10,000 copies are going to sell. It might if you have 1 million followers, right, that really pay attention to what you're doing. But if you're like most of us and you have a decent sized following, then we need to look at other ways to be spreading our message. And so podcast guesting can be really effective in doing that.
That's fabulous. Yes. And I'm such a believer in that. You're so right. How do we do it right is the question. Is like, okay, first of all, obviously getting on the right shows.
Yeah.
And then once we're on those shows, how do we optimize that opportunity? Where do we start with that?
I love that you're asking this. And just for everyone listening, we're gifting all of you, and Susan's going to tell you about it, our ultimate pitching kit that's free, because we have a ton of templates in there and stuff. And I go into more detail in that freebie. So in the spirit of time, the first thing is we do have to research, right? And I know you probably have this happen, Susan. I get this all the time where people will pitch me and I'm like, you didn't listen to my show. You didn't research me at all. You don't know anything about me. This is completely misaligned with the show. Like, your message is lovely, I'm sure, but this isn't in alignment with what we clearly focus on this podcast, right? That's just an exercise in frustration for everyone, but particularly if we look at our time, right? It's a very low dividend thing to be pitching ourselves. We can do it. That's our zone of competence. But our zone of genius is either being an author or being a service provider or whatever it is that only we can do. Other people can book us, for example, right? And other people can do research. But if we're going to pitch ourselves, we do want to make sure that we are seeing that person as a human. We're not coming at it from what can I get? We're coming at it from a place of what can I contribute? Because people can feel that a mile away. And when I get pitched and I can tell someone, or I even get it from some, I'm not going to say what publishing houses, but some big publishing houses where they'll pitch me and they'll say, so-and-so's just released a book and they want to come on and promote their book on your show. That's an instant no for me, because I spend time, money, and energy, as to you, Susan, building your audience that you cherish. I want to be bringing valuable content to my community, right? And so when someone thinks that just telling me they've published a book and that they're a big name, that's going to be compelling enough for me to have them on, it's not. Now, I know I'm a bit of a wackadoo when it comes to that, because other people might say, oh, this person's a big influencer, I'll have them on my show, but not for me. I love my audience enough to know who I want to bring on and how I want them to be poured into. If they were to come on my show and say, hey, I would love to come on and help your audience with these things, do you think that would be valuable to your audience? And by the way, I have a book. Do you mind if I mention it on the show? That's a very different conversation than someone leading with the book. Because what'll happen is, and you get this, I know everyone listening gets this, right? Like, when we're talking, there's a vibe that we're creating where people decide whether they know, like, and trust us. And that is what compels people to buy. And particularly as it relates to books, once they hear some of our anecdotes, once they hear a little bit of high level stuff that's in the book, then it's way more appealing for them to want to not only follow us on social media, potentially go and buy from us, but especially buy the book. And one of the tips I have for that, by the way, is if you can create a freebie that is a sample chapter or two that people can download for free so that they can feel into it. At the very least, that's a lead generation tool for you. But obviously, if they're 1 or 2 chapters in and they're interested, they have no choice but to buy the rest of the book, because they need to finish the story, right? Whatever the story is for them, the process, the story, the insight, whatever it is that we're giving to people. So that is something that I find really helpful. But it even starts with the pitch. Once you've done the research, does this person even have guests? If you're not seeing a single guest on their show, they probably don't want guests, and not all podcast hosts want them because they want it to be a funnel to their company. But if they do have guests, take a look at who's been on, what kind of things were they talking about? What are the gaps? What is someone not spoken about yet on that show? And how can you position your message in such a way that it's still relevant to your book and it's still relevant to your thought leadership, but it's going to be something with a twist that actually, like, sparks that person's spidey senses to say, ooh, this is amazing. I haven't done this before. This sounds really cool. And they lean in.
I love that. Yes, I mean, this whole idea of pitching, and I've talked about it on several shows too, that like you, I don't pitch books. But if somebody's got a book, absolutely, that's fine. I'll mention it, but that's not the purpose of the show. One of the questions that I get a lot, Jennifer, is, okay, yes, I want to be on podcasts, but how do I find the right podcast to be on? Could you help us with that?
Just LinkedIn alone. What I love about LinkedIn, side note, I've heard LinkedIn described as the most boring party on the internet with the world's most interesting people. And I do find that to be true. It's such an interesting place over there, and I meet so many amazing people, but the vibe of that platform is can feel kind of stuffy or a little bit too buttoned up, I think sometimes, right? But what I do love about LinkedIn is you can go into the search bar and just type podcast host or type podcast host, personal development or health and wellness, finance, or whatever your topic is, right? LinkedIn does the work for you. It brings you up a bunch of podcast hosts. You can spend, 2 minutes per profile, just kind of reading through what they're up to, who they are as a person, do a little bit more research, maybe 5 minutes in total, right? It's not actually that long, but it is, of course, time intensive, right? If you want to be on 10 podcasts, you're looking at a good hour of research and then crafting pitches for each one, right? Having a draft pitch, but then massaging it for each host. But that can be a great way to curate it. Another way is to subscribe to Harrow, which is a free website, help a reporter out. They're always looking for guests, and you can subscribe to different categories so that they're, again, bringing it to your inbox. I'm all about the internet doing the heavy lifting for me, by the way, wherever possible. And then the other thing we can do is when we type into Google and have Google send us everything to our inbox that day that's relevant to whatever it is we're looking for. So for me, I have one that's just for calls for speakers, right? For the stages I want to get on, and calls for podcast guests, things like that.
Yeah, those are the Google alerts. Are they the Google alerts?
Yes, Google alerts.
Okay, so that's an interesting one. So you would type in people looking for podcast guests?
Yes, but put some keywords in there of the types of topics that you would focus on, right? So for me, personal development is great. Thought leadership is great. Authors, intuitive development. I mean, there's all kinds of things I can put in there. I save myself from doing research. I could spend hours on Google trying to find podcasts, or I can have Google do the work for me. Alternately, the same will be true for going in some of these large Facebook groups that are relevant to your community. For example, there's a group, I'm giving her a shout out. I don't get anything for this, by the way, but there's a really large group. I think she's got about 600,000 members. It's called Women Helping Women Entrepreneurs. There's always people making posts in there about, hey, I'm looking for some more podcast guests on these topics. Who do you recommend? You can go in the search bar in these groups and type in authors. You can type in self-publishing. You can type in whatever words make sense. And it's going to curate the conversations that are already happening in that group for people that are already looking for you to then insert yourself, gracefully, of course, into the conversations and contribute to the posts and see what comes of that, right? And then there's even free Facebook groups, and also on LinkedIn, they're free groups where people are brokering deals with each other, essentially, right? And where you have an opportunity to pitch yourself again for people that are already looking for you.
Excellent. These are really different searches that I love. Always looking for new ideas. I know the one, obviously, you can go into Google and do a search on, the top podcasts in this area. You still got a lot of work because, as you say, you've got to find out, do they have guests, and is it really the right audience for you? So yes, I like that a lot.
And then the next, just a little aside, because I'm sure all of you listening have been on podcasts. Maybe you're just getting your feet wet, or maybe you've done a gazillion. But once you build a relationship with the host, you can say, hey, do you know anyone else, whose audience would benefit from my message today? Do you know any other hosts that are looking for guests to contribute on these particular topics? And usually they do. And then you're saving yourself even more time because you're getting a warm intro from someone that already has a relationship with the host that's looking for you that they didn't even know they were looking for you.
Yeah. And hey, just before you mentioned, I've got somebody I'd like to introduce you because I think they'd make a good guest for you, which is exactly, yes, we're looking for that as well. So I love the networking. I love these ideas of things that we could be doing. I think one of the most important things, and you mentioned this earlier, and that is to have a freebie, maybe a chapter in your book or some kind of lead magnet. But what else do you need to do on the podcast to optimize it so that someone says, hey, I really need to connect with this person. I think he, she is just the right person for me to connect with.
Great question. I always like to ask the host, what's something valuable I can talk about today? Again, I am a host and I know you are as well. And so I always operate from that lens. I have for the whole time I've been in business of how can I add value to this person's community? When I know what the audience is really going to want to hear about, I shouldn't be going on that show, by the way, unless I know what I'm talking about. I'm a big fan of staying in my lane and only going on shows that I feel I have a certain degree of mastery over a topic, right? I'm not interested in just spouting out knowledge. I want to be giving people something valuable. And so when I'm in that lens, then I'm likely going to be able to craft stories of what makes sense for the audience, right? Again, I'll share maybe some personal anecdotes, or I might share some client wins without it sounding really pitchy and testimonial-y, which isn't a word that I just made up. And then I also will seed a little, this is true of our business offers. This is true of everything, right? Where I might say, I love that you asked that question. We actually go really deep into that in chapter such and such of my book. But for right now, what I'll share is this. And that way I find very graceful ways to seed reasons why they should probably be getting the book, because I really and truly, we only have so much time on the show, right? So the goal isn't to cover the whole book at all. The goal is to pick maybe 3 to 5 really high level talking points that you want to go over to give people a general sense of the vibe of your book so that they want to do it. And then when we're being authentic and we're being heartfelt and we're allowing it to be a conversation instead of a monologue and various things like that, that person, they won't be suffering from listener fatigue, right? Which we all know what that is. And they're going to stay with us through the whole show. And even if they don't buy the book, that they're still compelled by your story, or they still really like you and they want to find a different way in, at least you've planted some seeds and activated them in ways that they can carry on that conversation with you after the show. Especially because these shows, our podcasts, live on forever, right? That's the thing with PR. It's not that PR isn't effective. It's that the news cycle is so rapid that your bestseller book gets lost in the fold. But as on a podcast, that lives on forever. Your freebie lives on forever, which is why it's always good, side note, to pick a freebie that you're married to, meaning like you think in 5 years' time, you're still going to be offering that freebie, because you just never know when someone's going to find the podcast and then find you.
Yes, that's so true, because as I told you earlier, we've been going 7 years now with this podcast, and we're in the 360 plus episodes that we've done in the time. I know that there are people who go back and listen to something that I might have done 2 years ago with a guest, because they've either looked up that guest or they looked up the topic area and it came up on Google, or even in my own category search, they might find something on book marketing, author marketing, ebooks. We've covered so many different topics over the years that someone might go back. So yes, having that history that's still alive that people can tap into, you just never know where somebody might say, oh yeah, when the student's ready, the teacher appears. Don't they say that?
Totally. I just discovered all kinds of reviews on one of my podcasts that I didn't even know were there, because I'm a crazy person. I'm just kidding, but I should know better, right? And I said to my team, I want you pulling reviews all the time now, because I want to be able to respond to people. I thought this was happening with our production team. And so I'm seeing reviews from like 2019 for this one show that I do. And I had no idea these people were listening to me, and I actually know them. And they didn't mention to me that they've been listening to the show, which they're not obligated to, but I just find it fascinating, right? So now I get to engage them differently and say, oh my goodness, I saw the review you left in 2019. I had no idea. And it's a conversation starter.
I know something that you also like talking about is sort of the shift in book marketing and sort of what's working and what's changing in this world, which there are books coming out galore. Over 3 million, I think, was the research I read recently that was published last year. So it's getting harder and harder to, stand out from the crowd. Talk to us more about, what you see as working and what you see we can let go of.
I'm glad you asked that. So as I mentioned before, the publishing houses give out advances. They give it to you in piecemeal to allow you to do the marketing to help. I mean, you're essentially helping them get more publicity, right? Like, yeah, you get to hook your name in with some big publishing house, but the perks there are not there. And most people are realizing now, hey, wait a minute. I want to own my IP. I don't want to do this much work to make someone else wealthier off of my IP. And I think I'm going to control how this goes down. And then on top of that, because the traditional publishing house industry is changing, which we all know, it's harder and harder to get those book deals. The advances aren't the same as they used to. Oftentimes, once people go through that process, they get to the 11th hour and it's contract signing time. And then they find out that there's magically some new conditions that are placed in there that weren't part of the original agreement, right? And all of that time, money, and energy being spent and tied up in a launch that, you're probably looking at 18 months to 2 years before that book actually gets published from the time you sign the deal. In self-publishing, we get to launch it as soon as the book's done, essentially, right? And I always recommend finding someone to help with the bestseller campaign if you don't know how to do it yourself, because why bother launching a book that nobody's really going to know about, right? We want to be leveraging these search engine tools. I mean, Amazon is probably one of the best search engine tools in the world, right? Even though we think it's a storefront, it actually is essentially a marketing tool, right? Where we can put our audiobooks on there, we can put our published books on there and so on. But we have to be more creative now about how we're selling books. And if we think about it, podcast guesting as an example, and this is true of stages, like we're being positioned as an expert if we write a book. Our brains can't help it. If we see an author, we instantly assume they're an expert. That's just how our brains work. What allows us to anchor our expertise even greater? Well, going on platforms where we're positioned as an expert, right? Even when you introduce me, you're introducing me as an expert in this topic. Whether or not other people perceive it that way is up to them, right? But here I am on a podcast, and we know podcasts have experts on. So I'm already being positioned that way. Then I'm borrowing your know, like, and trust that you have with your audience to be able to share my thought leadership on this topic as an example. Then on top of that, people are deciding right now if they feel I'm adding something valuable to their noodle, right, around what they want to consider for publishing and promoting their book and so on. Know, like, and trust gets established very quickly when we position ourselves as an expert. So whether it's podcast guesting, whether it's being on stages, whether it's being a guest expert in someone's Facebook group that's got 10,000 members, or whatever the situation is, when we pair up the expert tools that we're using, aka a book, with expert platforms and platforms that position us as experts, it shortens the curve even more because it seems aligned.
Yeah. No.
And even on top of that, if we're a steward of our thought leadership, we also want to be mindful of what stages we are on to make sure that it's aligned with our brand, that we're proud to share that podcast, because that's what the host is going to be asking us to do. Because one of the things we forget about is that hosts spend time, money, and energy producing the podcast, right? I don't know if you're comfortable sharing, Susan. I don't want to put you on the spot. I can say for our podcasts, we probably spend $250 per episode, right, to produce it, with all the tech stuff in there and various things like that. So some people will go on a podcast and think, oh, these people are lucky that I went on their podcast, right? It's like, no, it's actually a joint venture, right? It really is a joint venture in that that person has built a platform and is agreeing to extend their know, like, and trust to us. And so how can we be respectful of that? And how can we love up that host for helping us share our thought leadership? And the easiest way to do that, and really it's just kind of understood, it's the unspoken handshake, right? When we're on a podcast, that we share those episodes because we want to be spreading that message anyways. We want people to catch the fun things that we're saying on the show that maybe we haven't said before. But we also want to bring awareness to the host that was gracious enough to have us on in the first place.
Yeah, I love that. It is a joint venture, and I've never looked at it quite that way. I always hope and pray that my guest will help publicize it, but I can't enforce that. It's a sort of a respect thing that you would hope that they liked, as you said, that they liked the podcast enough that they would want to share it with, their fans and followers, which is obviously what I asked them to do.
Yeah.
So let us know how our audience can find out more about you. Obviously, the podcast connector, which is really a lot about what we've been talking about. How can they do that?
You can go to, as we mentioned, Susan has a gift that we've offered. It's the ultimate pitching toolkit. So if you want to just do it on your own, then you can download that for free. And we've got all the pitch templates and a whole process in there of how to go about pitching yourself right from the research stage onward. That's a great place to start. The Podcast Connector spends a lot of time on LinkedIn and Instagram. So you're welcome to follow us there. And then you can even just go to thepodcastconnector.com. There you'll see an opportunity to apply to work with us as well. We really like to partner with thought leaders that we feel proud to represent, right? And it may sound weird. I just know this from media, having done a lot of TV and so on, that my PR people, for example, build up a lot of relationship currency with different booking agents and different producers and so on. How it works and why it's so easy to guarantee is because we have relationships with these amazing hosts, right? And so we have to be able to represent people that are really showing up as a leader, essentially, right? That we're proud to represent, that relate to us through the lens of we're partners instead of people that are admin assistants for them, and nothing wrong with that. But I think you get what I'm saying, right? There's two different types of leaders that will engage us, and we work with the ones that recognize that we're partnering and that we then invite them to be represented by us, essentially.
Yeah, we'll put all that in the show notes, the website, and then this very generous gift. And by the way, listeners, I downloaded that gift beforehand and it is priceless. There's some templates in there that are extremely useful, pitch template, and then the one sheet, which so often we all need to go on to other podcasts. So that's lovely. So Jennifer, thank you for that. And if you were to leave our listeners with a golden nugget, what would that be?
Oh my goodness, there's so many. I did want to say too, one of the things that has changed in the marketing lens, and so maybe we'll end here, is that there's a lot of really big podcasts out there that I didn't even know were charging to be on there. Entrepreneur on Fire, by the way, which I can say because it's public, it charges $10,000 per appearance, right? So when we see people going on Entrepreneur on Fire, we think, oh, well, they're just such a big deal. They got on there because they're such a big deal. No, they got on there because they paid $10,000 to be on there. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. Everyone gets to make their own business decisions about whether they pay to play. But what's happening is there's a massively increasing trend of people paying or charging money, I should say, to have you on their podcast. So that's going to be an additional piece that you want to look for in your research, because you're going to end up engaging them, right? And maybe a significant amount of time and back and forth emails and so on to get you booked, only to find out that at the 11th hour, they magically, oopsie doopsie, forgot to mention that it's going to be $500 to appear, $1,000 to appear, that kind of thing. And that might be okay for you. For me, I don't do that, right? So that's not really something that I'm interested in, but I respect people's choice to do that, right? But to my point before, because it is an expense to produce a podcast episode, I think people are just trying to offset their expense. Sadly, they don't know how to pitch that. And so they're not usually upfront about that. Whereas, with us, for example, we already know who's pay to play, and we never ever pitch our clients to a pay to play engagement. And on top of that, if we get blindsided, you're not even seeing that as our client because we're buffering you from all of that kind of stuff, right? So you can just get on with it. But I will say, there's never, as Wayne Gretzky says, and I'm going to say this because he's Canadian, and I'm going to give a shout out to another Canadian, you miss 100% of the shots that you never take. So just get started. And when you start pitching, you'll get to see what's working, what people are responding to, what's landing with people. You just never know whose lives you're going to change by getting out there with your message and your book.
That's beautiful. It really is. It's so funny that you talk about Entrepreneur on Fire, because I remember when they started, and I actually was a guest on there way back when they started out. But now that they're charging $10,000, whoa, I didn't even know that. I think I'm missing out somewhere.
I think so. I think we need to create a course on, I honestly get it. I do get it, because he must just get gazillions. He probably is also losing money having to pay a team member that's solely dedicated to the volume of pitches that he gets, right? Not unlike a high ticket coaching container, not unlike all kinds of things. At some point, we do have to use pricing as a way to kind of separate out who's serious and who's not, right? And I'm not saying that I agree with that or not. I can just see the logic of it for sure. And I don't know if that's his logic, by the way. I don't know him personally, but I do know that I won't be paying $10,000 to go on that podcast.
Not now. I'll go back into the archives and look for my episode. It'll be even more valuable now. Maybe I
Totally.
can sell it on eBay or something for some ridiculous price.
It's like gold. It's appreciated in value for you. You totally should, especially with people knowing how much of a big deal it is to bring that episode back. That would be amazing.
That's so funny. That really is. Thank you. This has been quite a wake-up call as to this whole environment. So really appreciate the gems that you've shared with us, Jennifer. And thank you all so much for listening. And, listeners, if your book isn't selling the way you wanted or expected to, let's you and I jump on a quick call together to brainstorm ways to ramp up those sales, because you've invested a whole lot of time, money, and energy, and it's time you got the return you were hoping for. Go to brainstormwithsusan.com to schedule your free call. But in the meantime, I hope that this powerful interview sparks some ideas you can use to sell more books. Until next week, here's wishing you much book and author marketing success.